packet pushers.
Welcome to the IPv6 Buzz, where we dare to dive into the 128-bit address space wormhole. I'm Ed Horley.
And I'm Scott Hoag. On the show, we discuss all things IPv6, strategy, design, deployment, and operations.
And I'm Tom Coffeen. We've spent 20 plus years working with the IPv6 protocol. We run a consulting firm where we get IPv6 working for our customers.
And we're here to share some lessons learned and how to avoid common mistakes. We're glad you joined us today. We want to talk about starting fresh with IPv6 and what you might gain or have as an advantage by doing that. And there are a couple different topics we wanted to lead through in terms of the discussion here. And I think those were really talking about maybe reputation and routing and size and allocation impacts and what you get from starting fresh versus maybe trying to make do with more and more IPv4. Or maybe less and less IPv4 as it would be.
Yeah, exactly.
But let's talk a little bit about the address space to begin with, and maybe talk a little bit around the different types of address space you actually can obtain. And we commonly, in the past have talked about what we call PA and PI space. Maybe we talk a little bit about that just to get some vocabulary out of the way and talk about what the difference is between each of those and maybe how you could change your strategy versus what you do V4 to V6, because that would be a big change. Let's see. PA space, which is normally I hear referred to as provider assigned.
Yeah, and also sometimes referred to as provider aggregatable.
Aggregatable,
It's
yeah.
a little much more of a mouthful. I think I'd prefer provider assigned. I think it conveys a little more how it actually behaves and how you're intended to use it.
Yeah. And so that's effectively when you are using someone else's address space. You don't own it, you don't maintain it, but it's been assigned to you for that use. And so maybe the most common use case for most folks is if you have a service provider that's providing you internet service at home, more than likely you have PA space, right? It's being provided by that Comcast, Spectrum, whoever is your local internet service provider is going to go ahead and provide you the address space that you would operate and participate on the IPv6 internet. Is that a fair sort of statement?
Yeah, the downside is the provider assigned address space is not portable. You can't take it with you if you cancel the service. And there's a danger there and vendor lock-in risk if you address a lot of systems statically with that address space and then you change, you're going to have to readdress IPv6, and that's something we'd rather avoid.
There's also the impact for those that are using local internet service providers that your PA space could change on a regular basis. If you reboot your CPE device, you aren't guaranteed that you're going to get the exact same address space that you had, 5 minutes ago before you booted up. So they do have the flexibility to change that around on you. And for most use cases, that's not a big deal. But for those that like to have, fixed set of addresses, then be able to remotely get into their service if they aren't making use of dynamic DNS, things are going to be a little rough. That's the principle used for provider assigned address space, and this allows the service provider to obviously gain customers, provide the address to them. I would say the one that you aren't really super concerned with on the PA space is your mobile provider. So your mobile cellular handset is going to get whatever provider assigned address, and that should be just fine in terms of how that works. I don't think we would expect to bring our own address space for our mobile handset. I don't know. Maybe there's a use case there that I'm not thinking through. The description for the other one is normally referred to as PI space, provider independent is normally how I hear that referred to. And PI space is effectively that you went out and got your own address space that's allocated to you as an organization. And I say you loosely there. Usually that's an organization of some type that does a registration, although you as an individual could absolutely go and get your own address space from any one of the 5 RIRs. If you're qualified and want to pay the money, you can certainly get that. And that's really portable address space. It stays with you. It's not associated with the service provider, but you do have some extra work that you have to do related to PI space, right? In terms of how you route advertise, you're probably going to need an autonomous system number. You don't have to. I mean, you could write an agreement and have a service provider advertise your PI space for you on your behalf, but you do have to go through a few more hoops in order to make it work.
Yeah, and you kind of have to prove that you have a need for a certain amount.
Yeah, I think there's some minimum allocations that they'll do for you, but yes, you're going to have to sort of demonstrate some sort of need. Although your need could be like, I just want to run something on the internet and I don't want to have to be tied to a service provider. I think that would probably be more than adequate as an answer.
And sometimes historically, regional internet registry policies dictated that you had some public v4 address space registered with them as a requirement to get IPv6 provider independent address space.
Yeah, I don't know is that still the case?
It's been historical.
Yeah. I think they want to try and get as many people to V6 as possible now. So I think they're more than happy to hand out the addresses.
I think one other distinction that's probably worth mentioning is that also traditionally, if you were attempting to get PI space, there's a multi-homed requirement as opposed to a PA space. So, PA space, which is obviously provided by the provider, and it doesn't matter if you're single or multi-homed if you're getting all your space from the upstream provider. But if you want to get PI space, you need to have that multi-homed. You need to check that box that you're a multi-homed entity. You would need to announce space through different providers.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, well, let's talk about why we're talking about this to begin with, which is, sort of the fresh start that you get with IPv6. Now, with IPv4, it's so difficult to get public v4 address space anymore that really getting that what's considered provider independent IPv4 address space is increasingly difficult, very expensive. And many organizations just make use of PA space because their provider, who's providing them a local internet hop off or a local link, will provide them an address. You might only get a /30 and have to overload that address space, or you might be getting a /28 or something of that nature, right? That the provider is giving you in order to be able to give you, a few addresses to use locally to assign for firewalls and for maybe other network devices, right?
Yeah, chances are you're going to be natting that space.
Right. That's exactly right. With IPv6, obviously, we get much larger address space. So the possibilities for both PA and PI space increase dramatically. And we no longer are dealing with this very constrained small resource for those handoffs. And I guess the fresh start part is, what new opportunity does this give us? Is there some sort of new things that we could do or new ways that we could think about that are very different from how we think in V4 world in terms of how do we utilize this sort of abundance of address and prefix space that we are now given? And does it change how we think about things overall? And can we use that fresh start to really sort of change how the internet works, which is, I think, sort of an important discussion that we need to have.
I think early on we thought, well, could IPv6 offer a fresh start from an internet security standpoint? Would the IPv6 internet somehow be more secure or cleaner, or it'd be easier to create filters for the address space you've been allocated from RAR, because that's just a single entry in an access control list or something, or a single filter or single rule in a firewall or in a policy, where your IPv4 address being quite fragmented, it might be like 30 or 40 or 50 entries of all these different /24s and small little v4 prefixes that you have as a company that you've gotten through mergers and acquisitions and little pieces here and there. So it's not so easy to represent in IPv4, but easier to represent in IPv6. And if service providers did a better job of ingress-egress filtering, we could reduce, spoofed packets on the IPv6 internet. But now that IPv6 is more widely deployed, I think we still see that there's spam on the IPv6 internet. There's DDoS attacks on the IPv6 internet. There's still those issues on the IPv6 internet. But if you're starting fresh as an enterprise, your address space would be clean. It's never been used before.
Right. I don't think people realize how big of a deal that is. Right, in terms of the reputation side. I guess talking through a couple of use case scenarios might be helpful for folks around the reputation portion, just because it may be that a lot of people aren't super familiar with the reputation portion works for V4 today and how that might or might not impact you. I guess we can describe a couple, maybe public cloud is like a really easy and great example of sort of showing like where reputation could go sideways for you. Because of the reuse of address space that public clouds often do for their public v4, you could have turned a service on for a particular offering that a public cloud provider does, like maybe it's website services or some other SaaS service. And 5 minutes before, that could have been deprovisioned and could have been your competitor's address space, or could have been someone doing something nefarious, right?
Yeah, questionable site. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Questionable site. And with that, you end up with a situation where maybe that address gets flagged or marked as being problematic, right? In other words, it has a bad reputation for a particular service. And then suddenly you turn up that net new service for yourself and you don't understand why you're getting flagged as being a bad actor or having a bad reputation. You've inherited someone else's, right?
That's right. And the timing of that, like how quickly that can happen, I think that's really the key issue, because Obviously, the cloud providers have an incentive to not permit that sort of thing. If you have some nefarious service that's generating a bad reputation for an IP space, then your incentive is to shut that down if you want to be able to reuse that IP space. But the question becomes like, how quickly does that happen? And I don't know that we have a lot of test cases that prove one way or the other that that's, how much of a risk that is. And so at the outset, you can choose to mitigate that risk by just saying, well, hey, I'm going to just bring my own IPv6 address space into the cloud and use my address space, which of course the cloud providers now permit you to do.
Yeah, if you were to spin up a load balanced service, that cloud service provider could be using address space for that managed load balancer that uses v4 address that was previously assigned to a bad site or something. Or it could be an elastic IP or something you've bound to a web proxy of your own making, and you don't realize, yeah, that v4 address was used before and is on all these block lists, and extremely difficult to clean them up and get all those block lists around the world to remove your address. It might be easier just to delete that public-facing service and reinstantiate it all and hope that you get a v4 set of addresses that are clean. You could keep trying.
Yeah, and if you have a relatively complex deployment strategy, or it's much harder to then change those services because you're providing that address as something that other folks have to input into a security list, right? An ACL of some type to go access, you then have to reach out to all those folks and say, like, guess what? We got a new address we're using, and please discard the previous one because it had a bad reputation. Like, oh, wait a second, why did it have a bad reputation? And what sort of service are you selling me, right? That would be the first question I would ask is, why do you have that particular structural problem? It's like, oh, that's a cloud provider problem. It's like, no, it sounds like it's a you problem. So you got to be careful about this stuff. I don't mean to be trite about it, but the reality is that, the reputation portion could have some pretty serious impacts on your organization and your capabilities to roll deploy services or to trust other people, right? That's the other part. This is the reverse side, right? Is that you may be using a reputation filter, you may be using a platform that does reputation checking, and you want to subscribe to a net new service and it won't let you, right?
Yeah.
Because you're like, no, you can't use it. We're not going to go talk to that address. I don't care what that person says,
Yeah.
right? Because the reputation associated with that address is very negative.
Yeah, it just adds difficulty to troubleshooting for engineers, IT administrators. Oh, I can ping the address. Oh, I can SSH to it. Oh, I have end-to-end connectivity. DNS resolves properly. Why can't I establish a connection? Oh, there's this other service we're using, or there's something in a DNS filter or security service we're using, or a cloud access security broker. And those things are difficult to troubleshoot, that there's a negative reputation being used somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And you may not have control over that reputation process, right? If it's a SaaS service, right, they may be doing stuff on the backside to protect themselves, and you might never see it. If they don't float it up as an alert or a log piece of information to expose to you as an end user, then you're never going to know why that particular thing, outside of calling maybe their troubleshooting or help desk to escalate.
Yeah, 97% of our customers can reach the site just fine. There's 3% who can't. What's the commonality among that 3%? Oh, they all use reputation service ABC, and that address got picked up on their database.
Yeah, that's sort of interesting. So we talked about sort of the V4 world. What do we gain starting fresh start from a reputation basis with IPv6? Or what's the potential, I guess, for starting with a clean slate with the V6 side?
Yeah, addresses are brand new.
Yeah, I guess that's the number one advantage is we're taking it brand new out of package. It's not someone else's used IPv4 address space. We get to be the first ones to, I guess, maybe potentially sully it or leave it in its pristine state.
Do people create unboxing videos
Yeah.
of their IPv6 address?
Maybe that should be a YouTube thing. But yeah, I think that's a big deal. I think the fact that you can get adequate amounts of address space, that you can designate them for specific functions. So you could do things like say, oh, I want to use this address space for public cloud resources or SaaS services or other things that maybe you would never conceive to do with IPv4. Like you can't imagine going out into the market and saying like, well, I want to buy a bunch of IPv4 to hand out to my SaaS provider so that my reputation at that SaaS provider is held up by this address space. And If I decide to no longer use that SaaS provider, I will reclaim that address space. So it can't be reused by them to represent the Coke and Pepsi thing, right? Like one day it's Coke, the next day they reuse it for Pepsi, right? Sort of issues because that address space stays with you. So you're able to reclaim it. And if folks are trying to reach out or address services to that particular address space for any given reason, or they have security rules for it, if you move from one SaaS provider, maybe it's a CRM to a different CRM, that address space could move with it at the same time to allow you to simplify maybe how security rules work, or you could even assign different address spaces for different SaaS providers and simply just put them all under a larger prefix overall so that it's like, okay, all our SaaS provisioning is happening under this address space and we just assign out of that for each one of them. Same thing's true with cloud services. And so therefore the representation of your cloud service is tied to that address space and you can reclaim that address space and the cloud provider can no longer advertise anything with that address space if you remove it, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it's easy to know Coca-Cola's address space because it's 2620 colon C0CA colon C01A. It spells out the name, so it's easy to tell who owns it.
That's awesome. I think this is a unique opportunity in terms of reputation for the address space itself that you would not have with IPv4. You just can't do this. It's just there's too scarce a resource. It's been used too much. It's not something that exists in terms of scalability for anything that's happening. So I think that's a huge advantage and a huge thing that you could plan for, right? And I don't think that's something you would normally plan for in IPv4 if you're going out and doing an IPv4 net new architecture design or an allocation plan, right? Thinking, oh, I need this sort of address space for my public clouds. I say, oh, I need this sort of address space for SaaS services. Oh, I need this sort of address space for whatever potential areas, maybe it's IoT services, other things of that nature that you might want to hand address spaces out for to basically represent your organization externally. It's probably not a conversation you're having in the IPv4 world at all, at least not that I'm seeing happening in the industry.
Yeah, and with a lot of organizations, that consideration about having ample IPv6 address space that they control and they own, it's sort of an afterthought related to exactly how you described. If you're thinking about your cloud services and SaaS services, you're probably not necessarily making that connection to the address space that you're going to ask Aaron for. The size allocation that you're going to ask Aaron for may or may not make it into your planning. So it's definitely something that we want our listeners to be aware of when they're doing their IPv6 address plan. They're doing their initial sort of figuring out what sort of scale of address allocation is going to really check the boxes for them. They need to be considering the fact that they may be using some cloud allocation space, some IPv6 that they're bringing to the cloud space.
Yeah, that's super important to sort of think through. I guess the next one that sort of with that as a topic, the next one it sort of leads to is maybe talking about routing, because once you have your address space, you have to do some sort of routing with it. Right? And there is reputation associated with routing too, right? That's different than what we just talked through. Maybe we touch on that really quickly in terms of what you gain. Some of this does apply to IPv4. I think the reputation side for IPv4 routing is super important. And I know there's a lot of effort going on around securing v4 routing to be much more stable, right? Reputation wise, and then also probably more origination wise, right? Because of, back in the day when there was probably more route hijacking going on, and maybe even not malicious, but inadvertent route hijacking of people putting routes in that they just didn't really understand what they were advertising to the global internet overall. So we could talk through about the new initiatives that are going on around securing routing. And I consider that sort of reputation for routing itself, right?
Yeah, the Internet Society has their mutually agreed norms for routing security or MANRS initiative, and combined with RARs wanting their members to enable that.
Yeah, so let's talk about sort of that routing security component, because for me, I see that as like a net new sort of fresh start. If you're going to start turning up net new IPv6 prefix space, I would think from day one you would want it to be secure and you would want to own the reputation of who can advertise that address space from what providers, right? That would be high on my list of like a net new thing to do, which I think for v4, you're probably having to go back and retrofit this in. But with v6, you could start from day one, making use of everything recommendation wise from MANRS and really scale that up from there and get the operational muscle memory about how to do that work.
Yeah, when you get your provider independent address space from your regional internet registry, associate that with an autonomous system number in their database. So now their database is up to date. Leverage their certificate authority to create a route origin authorization. and then use that with RPKI when you advertise, your address block. Others will be able to validate that you're the legal owner of that address space. And you can't do this with provider assigned address space, of course. You can only do this with provider independent address space.
Yeah, that's a good point. You don't get to control that routing security for any of the PA space. Although I would have the assumption that your provider would be doing that on your behalf. So
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
hopefully, fingers crossed, they're doing that so that your address space doesn't get hijacked for nefarious purposes or get black holed for any given reason. That I'm assuming is happening automatically from the provider space. I guess with that and the routing reputation, the reputation of the address space itself, are there other considerations from the size allocation that you should actually ask for? Is there any impact in terms of like how you design and plan around this? Because you're starting greenfield, right? You probably got a brand new fresh start of like, I can ask for whatever size address space I should ask for. Is there other things that we should be scratching our head and thinking about and saying, hey, this is a net new opportunity. How much space should I be asking for?
Yeah, absolutely. As mentioned before, a lot of organizations that are new to IPv6 and aren't really considering that they may be using part of their allocation within the cloud, then the question becomes, well, exactly how much space do I need? And of course, that's a bit of a moving target because the cloud providers are changing over time, what provisioning requirements are there for various services that they're offering in terms of the amount of address space that it requires or the amount of address space that you can reasonably use or unreasonably use, as the case may be. We've seen you describe it, Ed, as left shifting, where the larger allocation just sort of implies that you're consuming more nibbles to provide that larger allocation, which is a shift to the left in terms of the prefix size. And that's something that over time you may see larger allocations being accommodated within the cloud to solve certain architectural challenges that are really sort of maybe nascent now and haven't really been thought through, but over time will create opportunities to use the address space.
I think this is one of the weird cases where you need to be okay requesting larger address space because you're going to leave it sit for the purpose of later use. And that's the future planning part. And all the RARs want you to future plan so that you don't have to come back and keep asking for additional address space over and over again. So they'd rather give you a larger allocation that can account for the innovation, the ideas, and the reputation stuff that you might want to take into consideration in your design. And as long as those fit within a reasonable category, they seem to be very open to going ahead and allocating, appropriate size resources for you to be able to do that.
Right. And Aaron in particular, makes it very explicit that they're concerned primarily about reducing disaggregation of the overall IPv6 address space, and that's more of a priority than, right sizing allocations to conserve what ultimately are just very tiny amounts of space, just minuscule amounts of space within the overall IPv6 address range. And so over time, we'll see how well that strategy works out. I mean, obviously, if you have a very large allocation, there's, depending on your provider arrangements, there's nothing that precludes you from making a lot of smaller, more specific announcements along with your summary. And of course, a lot of organizations will do that to solve architectural problems, routing problems, asymmetrical routing issues that crop up like that. But it's a bold strategy. Let's see if it pays off in terms of reducing the overall amount of the overall size of the IPv6 routing table over time by making those larger allocations up front to organizations that are requesting. But to your point, it's absolutely true. It means that we will be able to get a larger allocation to accommodate whatever architectural requirements you're going to have both on premises and within the cloud.
Yeah, I think that's key for folks to understand is that you might be doing a set aside for that purpose, and you might want to have planning that accounts for things that maybe you haven't thought about in the V4 space, things like mergers and acquisitions, right? Or things like net new cloud services or net new SaaS services that aren't even on the roadmap yet because they don't exist. They might exist in 10, 15, 20 years from now. And you would like to have something available for them if you think that's something that your business might be doing. I don't know. Did we cover most of it? Was there other things that we wanted to talk about from sort of a fresh start basis? I know we're talking mainly about address space and routing here. I mean, there are probably other categories of things that would be impacted by a fresh start in terms of like net new services and maybe sort of net new opportunities for deployment and scale that we really haven't sort of addressed from a sort of fresh start basis. Maybe we can do a different show about that in particular. But was there anything else we wanted to touch on?
Yeah, I think it's recommended that when you're starting fresh with IPv6, you get your addresses, set this up, set up, your route origin authorization, set up those things right from the start, learn how to do that, set it up for IPv6 right from the start. As you learn, then you could back apply that to your v4 address space, once you get familiarity with the process of how to do that. But also we see in the United States, the National Institute of Standards and Technology has a website, an RPKI monitor, where they monitor route origin validation of different prefixes. And you can look at v4 or v6. And you see, while there's more route origin verifications done in lots of v4 address space, the percentage of v4 ROVs that they've seen is 53%. It's a percentage of the million or so prefixes that are in the default free zone. While IPv6 has fewer prefixes, 251,000, the percentage is actually higher. It's 55% IPv6. So we see it's only a couple of percentage higher, but we see that people, when they start out with IPv6, they start out doing this right from the start. And so that's the recommended approach for organizations. Don't set up your BGP, advertise your address space, and then later go back and have to do this as an afterthought. Set it up right from the start, cleanly, with this good reputation. The time to do it is when you're setting it up the very first time. That's the recommendation.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of IPv6 Buzz. If you've got feedback or a follow-up on this topic, send us a message at packetpushers.net/FU. We'd love to hear from you and continue the conversation.
Also, on packetpushers.net, you'll find a range of deep dive technical podcasts for IT pros, including heavy networking, heavy wireless, and Day 2 cloud.
There's a whole lot more on the Packet Pushers site as well, such as tutorial videos and a networking job board to help you find or fill your next great role. So whether you're deep in your career or just starting up, Packet Pushers is the place to go to grow both your skills and your personal network.
So long and until next time, we'll see you on the IPv6 internet.